Friends and comrades, good morning from Athens. I am delighted and honored to participate at your critical legal conference and to see critical legal studies develop in Turkey. Let me first thank the conference organizers. I know how difficult it is. I have organized quite a few conferences in my time, but of course not with that devil of the Zoom connection, which is always a problem. And I would like also to thank Ezgi for the invitation. Ezgi has introduced me to the Turkish critical legal scene, and I hope in the next 2 or 3 years perhaps to have the European Critical Legal Conference take place in Turkey. Our conference has been going on for the last 35 years and takes place every year in the first weekend in September. We have moved around Europe to many places, and I think Ankara or Istanbul should be one of our next places to come and meet up, talk, help further the critical legal scene. Friends, we live in dark times. The news from the Gaza report every day new crimes, new atrocities. And international law, I think, is a good example of the problems of all law, the whole legal system. The law, international law, has become disreputable and is unable to prevent the disasters. The law of the powerful has always imposed itself on the law of justice and morality. So as long as the powerful use law as a fig leaf, as a tool to justify their brutalities, people exercise the right to resist oppression, to resist domination, to resist exploitation. And our job as lawyers is to defend that resistance. Because critical theory is committed to human emancipation. It combines political radicalism and intellectual innovation. It is a response to the intellectually inaccurate and morally impoverished mainstream scholarship of law, scholarship of the philosophy of law, the function of which is to legitimize the social and political order. So resistance and the right to resistance are crucial tools, are the arms of critical theory, and we are here to defend them. So let me give a broad theory of resistance based on my experience over the years, and also based on a theoretical understanding largely influenced by Karl Marx and Michel Foucault. Now, humanity starts in disobedience. Adam and Eve defy God's command, leave the Garden of Eden, and that's how humanity starts. Prometheus in Greek mythology steals fire from the gods and gives it to people starting civilization. For Sigmund Freud, the murder of the father by his sons and the guilt they feel leads to the creation of morality. Gods, mythical legislators, are created by humanity so that they can give us the law to legislate commands and prohibitions, which become, in psychoanalytical theory, the source of desire. And of course, desire is the mark of humanity. If we now look into political history, resistance and disobedience in modernity, which, as you know, are condemned as criminal, mad, seditious, have led to most freedoms we take for granted. The emancipation of slaves, universal vote, restrictions on the brutal exploitation of labor, basic recognition and rights for women and minorities. Take away resistance and action by the people from the history of the last 2 centuries, and our world would still be a kind of Hobbesian war of all against all. Resistance has changed regimes, has changed constitutions, has changed laws, and to a certain extent keep the law dynamic, and active. But when does resistance arise? How does it work? Can it ever succeed? How can it succeed? So I organized my comments along 7 points, 7 theses on resistance. Thesis 1, resistance is a physical law of being. Like power, resistance is a relationship, a series of interactions amongst people and things. It keeps changing the balance of forces, disturbing asymmetries of power, amending the position of the participants, the one who has the upper hand in the relationship. And of course, if power is a relationship, and this is the Michel Foucault position, resistance is its condition of existence. If it is a relation, there must be existence for the relation to operate. Therefore, resistance is not a force of violence that comes from outside the relationship, but it is an integral part of the relationship. Gilles Deleuze, commenting on Foucault, said precisely that. The final word on power is that resistance comes first. Thesis 2, resistances are situated, local, concrete. They react to a unique balance of forces, a state of affairs, an event. This local operation is evident in most cases of political resistance. Let me give you a few examples. In early modernity, Luddites and diggers responded to the capitalist destruction of traditional skills and crafts by sabotage and the breaking of machines. Today, because there is excessive debt amongst people, we have repayment strikes and calls and protests for debt reduction, both of states and of individuals. The intensification of work leads to the demand of reducing working hours and the right to leisure. The hostility to immigrants leads to demands for the abolition of borders, for civil rights for everyone who is in a country, and for a minimum guaranteed income. And of course, I know very well the problems that you have in Turkey with refugees and the treatment by the state of refugees. And of course, in Greece, where I'm speaking from now, the government, the right-wing government, has acted in the most barbaric way towards refugees by pushing them back to come back to Turkish waters, and by allowing recently in June a boat carrying 750 immigrants coming towards Europe from North Africa to sink. All 700 people perished, and the Greek Coast Guard was next to the boat but did nothing to stop it. Again, extensive surveillance that we have everywhere has led to hacking, to WikiLeaks, to citizen journalism, which records state and police brutality. So every specific form of oppression and domination leads to specific, concrete, individual forms of resistance that differ from case to case, precisely because resistance is part of the power relationship, and resistance aims to change the balance of forces. 3, resistance is a mixture of reaction and action, negation and affirmation. Reactive resistance conserves and restores a state of things. Active resistance borrows, mimics, and subverts the adversaries, the powerful entities, tools, and terms in order to invent new rules and assemble new institutions. But power reacts too. It is a relationship. So when dissidents create new configurations, new institutions, new ideas, the state can also take them for its own purposes and change those new institutions from resisting to part of the ruling power constellation. Let me give you a few examples. When the Western centralized state emerged in the 16th century, its main task was to develop productive and pliant populations, workers and soldiers to man the factories and the armies, which then became the great colonial armies going around the world and spreading Christianity, religion, and Western power. Now, the farmers who lost their livelihood when land was taken on and was no longer communal, those farmers moved to cities and became what people called at the time, and still, the mob, the horde, those great unwashed, the terror of the rising bourgeoisie. The state responded to the protests of the farmers and the people who had lost their livelihood and came to the cities with a huge display of increased police powers, repression, punishment, the reason of state, raison d'etat. And the first kind of resistance to that kind of huge increase of police power came from political philosophy and then from lawyers, which developed a certain types of resistance, philosophical resistance, theoretical resistance first, against state authoritarianism. The theories of natural law and social contract, which developed in the 16th century, did not, of course, speak about any real contract that was ever created amongst the people in order to establish the state. Those theories were a way through which philosophy and then law claimed that power, state power, must rely on the consent of the governed and therefore follow legal procedures. So it was an attempt, those theories were an attempt which lawyers then in the great declarations of the 18th century, the Déclaration des droits de l'homme or the American Declaration of Independence, tried to turn them into real legal instruments. So liberal jurisprudence took up this original idea and argued that, and argues still, that individual rights limit, rationalize, and legitimize sovereignty. Liberals claim that sovereignty and rights are involved in a zero-sum game. The more rights we people have, the weaker the power of sovereign, and vice versa. But this analysis totally misunderstands what happened in the 19th century, the biopolitical change in the way that power operates. Life was politicized, and the care for life was taken over by the state. Biopolitics aims to control and correct the life of the population and uses criteria such as natality, mortality, morbidity rates, and average life expectancy, the training of the population, and so on. And in that sense, biopolitics deals with populations and classes, not with individuals. We saw it in the pandemic, where the state approach was to impose those lockdowns and other limitations. And when individual people, as a result of that, either lost their livelihood or lost their life, when those lockdowns were not effective in many places in Britain where I lived, then the state did not care. The state deals with populations, not with individual rights. So we're ruled, we're governed as living beings and as members of a population according to gender, race, age, ability, which are classifications, ways of distributing state policies to different groups of people. And of course, individual rights are not important. Again, the same applies with refugees. In the case of Greece, The state deals with refugees as a population which is undesirable. They don't want them to come here, and therefore the individualized rights under the Refugee Convention, under international human rights law, and so on, are being totally forgotten and sidelined. The population, the treatment of the population trumps, undermines, destroys individual rights. So in this sense, rights, legal rights, which initially developed as protections against sovereignty, were integrated into the socio-economic operation of biopolitics. The form of right, because it had acquired a certain status and prestige, was taken over by the state, and rights were turned from what natural law and social contract theory considered as being innate and natural into they became liberties that are justified by economic utility. So rights remain, but they were no longer just defenses of individuals against the sovereign. They became part of the way in which the state and sovereignty controlled populations. The state became the organizer of economic interests, and rights were part of this strategy of economic management. For the liberal government of the end of the 19th century, the self-limitation of the state, which once was part of the legal protection of individuals, now became factual, a matter of fact, based on the economic logic and the calculations of the homo economicus, the person who deals with life in terms of cost and benefit, in terms of profit and loss. So that is what became the limit of governmental action, and not the legal rights of the homo juridicus, of the legal person with rights and duties. What happens then when these rights are suspended, limited, abolished, as it happened more recently during the pandemic, or as it happens when an occupation force like Israel enters Gaza, when they do, and of course they've done it so many times, and all these legal rights stop. They don't exist anymore. There's no defense of based on the rights of the law. A new type of right now emerges. Dissidents use a form of right which is far distant both from sovereignty and the state, and biopolitical controls which deal with populations. We, the citizens, are bound by our solidarity. We have a common characteristic, and this is not just the citizens in one particular state, the citizens in the world, everywhere, both in Turkey and in Britain and in Greece. Our common characteristic is that we're governed, we're ruled by governments. This commonality, this common characteristic creates a different type of right, which is exercised when the government, when its policies fail. We call it a right because we do not have an alternative term, but it is neither a legal nor a moral right. It is a biopolitical right. These rights come into existence when the people declare in public that we do not want to be governed like this, in such an excessive, wrong, authoritarian, exploitative manner. They are the rights of the ruled, the governed. They are grounded, they arise out of our own independence and our own solidarity. Solidarity with people who suffer, solidarity with people in different parts of the world, in Palestine, in the Gaza Strip at this point. So these rights, unlike human rights, are neither natural nor legal. They are created when people protest and try to defend themselves, or when they rebel and try to change the balance of power. At the point when human rights and legal rights do no longer operate, They have been suspended. They have no power, legal power behind them than those biopolitical rights of solidarity emerge, and they become the way through which people react to power. 4, resistance changes subjectivities and constructs new identities. Individual, but also collective subjects emerge in relations of power. We, the subjects, are always subjected. We're subjugated to the dominant forces. We become free because we accept our subjugation. Resistance is now unpick that kind of subjection and redirect the subject. A few words about the psychoanalytical understanding of resistance. At the individual level, revolt, resistance lies at the foundation of self. For Freud, happiness exists at the price of revolt. There is no pleasure without obstacles, prohibitions, interdictions, without the law, its injunctions, prohibitions, and sanctions. The pleasure principle calls upon us to conform, to obey the law, to fit in the social order. But this accommodation to the world, this pragmatic acceptance of how the world and the order operates, and we are fitted into that, this type of attitude, common attitude, is accompanied, is followed by the transgression of prohibitions. The revolt, the Oedipus revolt against power, which is symbolized by father, by king, by emperor, and by the law as their language, it is that revolt which grounds the independence of the self. We have and we do rebel against paternal or kingly power in order to become independent. Autonomy, individual autonomy, emerges as the price and reward of revolt. Legal and social obstacles open this route of revolt and allow us to become autonomous. But of course, revolt is also part of a darker, timeless urge, what Freud and Lacan call the death drive. And that lies beyond and contradicts the pleasure principle. In 2011, I spoke in the Syntagma Square in Athens to the assembly of the Indignados, the occupation in Athens. You remember that period of occupation started in North Africa, then they moved to Spain, then to Greece, Turkey, Gezi Park, but all over the world, New York, Rio de Janeiro, everywhere, people started protesting and rebelling. So I was speaking there in Athens, and then after the talk of the panel, people started queuing up to make their point. And there was one particular person, a man, who was clearly trembling, shaking from nerves. Perhaps he'd never spoken in public before, and he was clearly worried. When his turn came, however, he started speaking in the most beautiful way, both rhetorically, in terms of the way he constructed his speech, but also in terms of ideas, in terms of the strategy that he was putting forward to the assembly. When he finished, I went up to him and I said, my friend, I was really surprised by the way that you spoke. So beautiful, so well constructed. But just a minute earlier, I saw you shaking and trembling and really feeling so unwell. I thought you were going to faint, to fall down. And the guy says to me, yes, exactly like that. That is how I felt. I felt that I could not do it. I could not speak in public. But as soon as I got the microphone, then everything changed. I started speaking words that a stranger in me was dictating to me. There's a stranger in me. The stranger in me came out at that point, and I was changed. I was metamorphosed. Now, this for me was an extremely important case, because individual or political revolt is the instrument of the excluded, the dominated, and the oppressed. We become new subjects. The stranger in me emerges when we realize that we have a split in ourselves. Our existence misfires. Our identity cannot be completed. And at that point, I pass from the particularity of normal, common sense, everyday life to the universality of resistance. We become subjects, resisting subjects, and subjects altogether when we realize that the gap in our identity is not our fault or failure, but symptom of wider systemic flaws. When an unemployed realizes that his condition is a symptom of capitalism, of the disease of capitalism. When an undocumented immigrant realizes that her condition is the symptom of a political and legal system that divides people between the fully human, the lesser human, and the non-human. When a gay or lesbian realizes that the suppression of their sexuality is a symptom of a system that disciplines and controls bodies. At that point, when we realize that split in ourselves is the outcome of wider systemic failure and not our own personal fault, when we realize that, we become subjects of resistance. I pass over to the side of the universal because my particularity has failed, but it has failed not because of my own fault. The negation and the failure of a daily routine identity opens the road to the universality of resistance. It involves risk, perseverance, resilience. Resistance is the courage of freedom. Fine. Resistance is a fact, not an obligation, and is not an ought. It does not simply apply values and principles, and does not have a predictable point of explosion. We don't resist just in the name of something. Resistance is the bodily reaction to an overwhelming sense of injustice, the irrepressible response to hurt, to hunger, to despair. It happens when the question, how can I live like this, converts into conviction and action. I will not continue to live like this. Enough is enough. Ideas, therefore, are not the cause, but the result of resistance. Justice, equality, or solidarity survive or perish because of resistance. Let me give you a few examples that resistance starts and then it becomes generalized into universal ideas. In classical Greece, the idea of logos, of reason, of all ruling reason, and the idea of physis, nature, were initially weapons invented by philosophers in order to use them against the ruling elders and the priests. So philosophy invents reason, invents nature in order to defeat that old power of the elders, of the older people, and the priests. Christ, his teaching started as part of Jewish resistance against the Roman Empire. Early Christianity was a small and persecuted sect before turning into a global religion and, of course, an empire with all the results, the negative results we know. So normative claims often start life as strategies of resisting local domination and oppression. And the same was the case with individual rights. They started as legal claims of Europeans, excluded from political rule, and then they became liberal principles of legality and morality, often used by the state against individuals, particularly in this biopolitical operation I mentioned earlier. Today, rights, human rights, are paradoxically both the ideology of late capitalism and, of course, the cry of dissidents. Rights survive because people resist and invoke them as a battle cry, as a shout, as a chant against state arbitrariness and violence. Laws and rights exist and are respected by state authorities because people defend themselves. No constitution, not any law guarantees those rights without popular resistance. This means that I cannot become a subject of resistance simply because I read lots of Marx and lots of Foucault and lots of theory of justice or whatever. Love and revolution come unannounced, like a miracle. One is hit on the head, like a blow, the wonderful French word coup de foudre, this love at first sight. It hits you on the head. After that, nothing remains the same. Joining the uprising, joining the occupation, joining the protest, irrespective of ideological commitment, is more important than ideology or teaching and reading books. I spoke 2 or 3 occasions in Gezi Park, and again, an instance, a little incident happened there has stayed with me. A mother, a protester, told me that the first time she found herself by chance, she did not know that the riot police was about to attack, and she was passing there with her daughter on her way home, and then the riot police attacked, and she was absolutely paralyzed with fear. People, the other members of the occupation, pulled both the mother and the child back and gave them water and protective masks. Her initial reaction was to push them away because we're not used to the caring touch of strangers. We don't want to be touched by strangers. But once she realized that people were trying to help, that the touching of the strangers was part of the care, of the love of the strangers to her and her daughter. Once she felt that force of solidarity, the fear left her. She came back, she told me, to the occupation every evening. And again, that kind of approach, like the man who said a stranger in him told him what to speak, shows the way in which we pass from our daily routine life to what is for me, the universality of resistance. 6, resistance and its subject emerge through the exercise of the right to resist. Now, of course, you will tell me, from Kant and Hegel all the way to our constitutions and our international treaties and so on and so forth, the right to resist has been banned. It does not exist. Kant and Hegel said that a constitution cannot legitimize and include in its articles a right to resist against the very same constitution. However, despite the fact that this right has been banned, it keeps coming back, returning like the repressed every time when people feel that enough is enough, we cannot take it any longer. So while resistance is a fact, not an obligation, as I said earlier, the right to resist, to my mind, is the oldest, indeed you could say the only natural right, the oldest, from the Hebrew religion to Christianity to Islam, that right, that resistance is there and it comes back. And therefore, the right to resist, despite its deletion from codes and constitutions and international conventions, is what I call perhaps the oldest natural right. But it is different from legal and human rights. Indeed, what is a legal right? There are 3 things. First, it is individual will and action. Second, this will is justified. There is a law that says that you have this right. And third, it is enforceable. In other words, the law or state power will enforce your individual will if it is not able to implement itself. So 3 things: an individual and her will. Second, a justified will and action, and third, enforceable by the law. So, to give an example, the right to property or the right to free speech has a single source. This is the will of the person who has the right and exercises it, his right to speech. Second, it has a single justification. The right has been recognized by the law. And third, it has a single effect, that the right holder, the person speaking, can act, can speak, and save the world, and the law will enforce it if, of course, it wants. However, when political rights and later socio-economic rights were modeled on individual property, which was the oldest and the model of all other rights, the unequal effects, the unequal operation of property contaminated, undermined other rights as well. At that point, when it became clear that the form of rights does not always help people defend themselves, individual will, the source of right, as I claimed earlier, split, separated, divided into two. First, that accepted and justified by the law. In other words, legal rights. Those rights that you go to court if other people do not respect them, and perhaps you may win that enforceability by the state. But there is a second, collective will, which split away from the legal right, and that is adopted by the dominated and the oppressed, for whom right is not about law, judges, and courts, a game that they cannot play, they cannot even have the money to play it, but a game that is of no interest to them. The collective right, this second will, becomes a battle cry, the subjective factor in a struggle. When people say, I want this or that right, they don't mean I want to go to court and get a lawyer to defend me. They say that we are here and we claim rights as a way of changing the world or a particular component of the world. Right, therefore, has two sources. As legal right, it is a claim accepted by the law or trying to get acceptance by the law. But secondly, right is a collective will that finds its force in itself, not in law, not in legal text, but in its own dynamism, energy, and resistance, and finds its effect in a world which is not the existing world, which is not the world with the balance of forces and the asymmetries that we know, but a world that is not yet determined, a world still to come, a world that it is not totally decided by political, military, and economic might, force, power. This second right has its perspective, its horizon in an open cosmos, in an open world that is not the world we live in today, but it is the world that we're fighting to achieve as a horizon, as a way in which we act today, we fight today to change the world today and tomorrow. Final, 7, collective resistance becomes political and may succeed in changing the balance of forces when it condenses different causes, when it brings together a multiplicity of struggles, some national or international, others local and regional, and brings them all together in a common place and time. It is not just one complaint, one grievance, one struggle that can change the world. It is when different types of claims, different types of campaigns and battles converge in a common place and time. We can see that happening with the occupations in Syntagma or in Porta del Sol or in Gezi Park. We have entered since 2010 an age of resistance. We don't know when the global wave of protests that started in 2010 will return, when Syntagma or Gezi Park will return, but we know they will. The collective campaign to build a world safe from inequality and domination are inevitable, cannot be stopped by states or governments or laws. Our job as critical lawyers is to be the conscience of our society, the defenders of individual disobedience and collective resistance. It means that we appeal as lawyers to two types of justice. One, immanent, internal justice. The second, transcendent, external. Immanent justice. When state and law do not perform their duties, violate the rights they have themselves legislated and claim to respect, then we call them to account. Transcendent justice, when we place the whole of the law in the tribunal of history and demand another law and another justice. What the state fears is the challenge to its power by a force that can transform the relations of law and present itself as having a right to law, a right to create a different legal system. In such cases, politics becomes the prescription of the possibility of rupture with what exists. In that sense, as critical lawyers with the two types of justice, we're somewhat schizophrenic, inside and outside the law. Sometimes we're in the court, arguing legally when the state does not give what the law offers. We have good legal arguments, good arguments in the legal language in order to win the rights that people are supposedly given by the state, but the state does not actually apply them. On other occasions, we're outside the court, protesting and shouting that your law and your state will never give people the justice and equality of humanity. Occasionally, we have to do both things at the same time, both arguing in the court and shouting outside the court. This is what we have to do as much as we can in our dark times. But on the other hand, the solidarity, that help that exists amongst ourselves and internationally, I think allows us to imagine of a different world, of a different justice in which all people, every single one of people will have their rights and their dignity fully respected. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor, for this thought-provoking presentation.
If any of our comrades there is interested in any of the parts of my talk, I would be very happy to answer emails, or you can pass my email to all your comrades and be very happy to answer to them. And I hope that one day, pretty soon, our conference, Critical Legal Conference, will come to Turkey and we will develop much closer relationships with you guys there.
Professor, I would like to thank you on behalf of our community as well. It was a great presentation. It was very thought-provoking, and we hope to see you soon in Turkey.
Thank you, and have a great conference. Enjoy being with each other. This is our great force. Bye-bye, and see you soon.
Bye.